This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. With us this evening, Daniel Greenfield, a Shillman Journalism Fellow of David Horowitz Freedom Center and the editor and writer of the blog The Point at Front Page Magazine, and he is back by popular demand. Daniel, welcome back to the Glazov Gang.
Thank you. I know if it's popular demand, but I'm glad to be here by your demand.
Thank you so much, Daniel. All your articles at the Point are so fascinating. You had one recently on Mikhail Gorbachev, who just passed, and Gorbachev is very much seen as the person who, you know, put together glasnost, perestroika, kind of oversaw, if that's a word to use, the dissembling of the Soviet Union. He's seen, at least by the establishment left in the West, as this democratic reformer who, you know, did good things. But you had a little bit of a different perspective on Gorbachev. So with Gorbachev's passing, he's such a significant figure. Of course, it was in many respects the end of the Cold War. I'm not sure it was the end, but the Soviet Union did collapse to some extent. But anyway, let me hand it over to you. You had quite an interesting take on Gorbachev.
Gorbachev certainly oversaw the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, but it wasn't an intentional act. Rather, he was trying to buy time. If you go back to where the Soviet Union was, when he took power, the economic situation was absolutely catastrophic. Communism had failed badly. The morale wasn't there. And, you know, like Andropov, like others, declining Soviet leaders, he was trying to buy time. He was trying to trick the West into subsidizing the Soviet Union again. And there's history to this, because if you go back to the early days of the Soviet Union, when the communists first took over, there's famine, there's absolute misery, and they managed to trick the West into bailing them out. Herbert Hoover, to his credit, actually insists on having his people supervise the distribution of food. FDR, however, who is surrounded by communist agents, just opens the door, recognizes the Soviet Union. Resources pour out of the United States. This actually enables the Soviet Union to function, to become a power. So, you know, at every turn, really, in Soviet history, it was the United States, it was the West that bailed out the communists, that enabled the communist regime to stay in power. And Gorbachev was just trying to do what past Soviet leaders had done, which is try to fool the West to get aid, get money, get some kind of support. And he wanted to be seen as the good guy. It was carrot and stick. And, you know, the guys behind the scenes, they're the ones who are the extremists. They have the stick. And Gorbachev wanted to be seen as the guy you have to subsidize. And Islamic terrorists, since then, as you've written, have pulled the same stunt over and over again. They're the moderate Islamic terrorists. Those are the extremist Islamic terrorists. Bottom line is, Gorbachev was a communist leader. His goal was to perpetuate and maintain communism. Since he was forced out of power, he would say all sorts of things, but the bottom line is that was this was about. The whole thing fell apart with the coup. Some people suspect that this would have been a prearranged gambit where the so-called extremists came to power, and then Gorbachev would have a stronger position negotiating with the West. Instead, Yeltsin got up. There was popular Russian resistance to that. The military refused to comply with orders to restrain the crowd, and the bottom line is communism fell. But it wasn't because of Gorbachev, or it wasn't consciously because of Gorbachev. It was because Gorbachev's game had spun out of control, resulting in the fall of communism.
So complicated, Daniel. Communism fell. You know, obviously, I have a lot of interest in this issue because of my background and my parents, etc. And, you know, I do a lot of research. I know the arguments that the whole thing was a trick, that, you know, the Soviets had convinced the West that there was reform, but really, and I mean, there's a lot to say for the fact that maybe there was a trick of some kind, because who ended up staying in power? The KGB, Putin, and all that stuff. But before we go there, no matter how much conspiracy there is with the powers that be, there's always free will and the human dynamic. So whether or not they had this plan to trick the West by pretending there was reform and all this stuff to soften the West, But in terms of that coup, in terms of Yeltsin, in terms of the dissembling of the Soviet Empire, it's very far-fetched to think that that was all kind of orchestrated by people pulling strings from on top, right?
Well, the bottom line is that the communism itself was ultimately unsupportable and unsustainable. They couldn't maintain this entire, we were having this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. They were owed us enormous amounts of money. They were actually dependent on us for food. They were buying our wheat in massive numbers because the agricultural system, the entire Soviet agricultural system had effectively come apart. So much else had come apart. The whole thing was just falling apart. And this was, as I mentioned, not the first time this had happened, but this was really catastrophic. And they were once again absolutely in desperate need of our help. And the bottom line is we did end up bailing them out yet again after the Soviet Union fell, with the result that the cycle repeated itself. If the Russia ends up under Putin or post-Putin falls apart again, once again, we're going to go there. We're going to spend insane amounts of money trying to rebuild it. And I think the cycle will repeat itself again. And it's not just Russia. We've had this with any number of countries around the world. It's unfortunately a very destructive perpetual cycle where we feel impelled to fix the world, to save all these various countries. And the result is it becomes an even bigger mess. Of course, there's a higher hand in all of this. Certainly quite a few religious people, Jews and Christians, believe that there was this hand of God in the collapse, in the fall of communism. Communism had claimed that it would actually stand in the place of God. It would actually bring a kingdom of heaven on earth. And instead, what we saw was just perpetual misery, one kind of misery, another kind of misery, cults of personality. Lenin would be this cult figure, then Stalin, then it became every Soviet dictator would become the new cult figure. And it was actually kind of like the pharaohs in ancient Egypt or the Caesars, the Roman emperors, and one would fall and they would bring the statues of the new one and tear down the old statues. And it had become this pathetic idolatry that conclusively you would think disproved the idea that socialism, that the left's economics actually worked when applied in the real world.
Thank you, Daniel. So the tragedy in all of that and all of this is that with the Nazis, there were Nuremberg trials. And Nazism was, thank God, completely delegitimized. They executed and tried these horrible, evil monsters. Nazism as an ideology was completely discredited, demonized, delegitimized, etc., etc., and thank goodness. And so the fall of the Soviet Empire, Horowitz has written quite a bit about this, especially in his book, The Politics of Bad Faith. My dad also was stressing at that time, there needs to be Nuremberg-style trials. They got to bring these leaders to, have trials and have the very idea of Marxism, the very idea of socialism put on trial, put class hatred on trial. We know that didn't happen. We know there was no mea culpa from the West, from the Western left. The left kept its ideology intact. They were very threatened by what happened in the Soviet Union. But we never saw the trial of Marxism. And it explains very much why, the Cold War in many respects remained. Why Putin, why a monstrous KGB mafiosa thug is in power in Russia today. And yeah, to some extent, things had changed after the fall of the Soviet regime. For a while, maybe there was a little bit more quote-unquote freedom in some ways, but there still remained a terror on many levels, especially now. We know that if you start criticizing Putin, things may happen to you that happened to Anna Politkovsky and Litvinenko and Navalny, etc., etc. What do you think of the lack of the Nuremberg-style trials for communism after the fall of the empire?
It was a tragedy. Yeltsin sort of talked about doing it, and then the idea fell away. And there was this brief window where the system had collapsed, and you had actually people getting access to KGB archives. And we learned quite a bit about the death camps, about the gulags, about the mass murder of people in countries where the whole thing completely collapsed, like East Germany. Then they actually got all of the files, at least they got a lot of the files. Putin actually played a role back then. He was in East Germany in preserving and keeping some of those files away. But they found that just how many people had been informing on their neighbors, and there was a kind of a reckoning. In Russia, there was this just very brief window where people were able to get access to files. They exposed some of it. They exposed a fraction of it. Since then, particularly under Putin, there's been effectively no investigation allowed. There was a museum that was actually dedicated to documenting the various communist atrocities. Under Putin, that was turned into a museum glamorizing and glorifying the KGB, which is, of course, entirely predictable. There was a law passed actually banning any comparison between communist atrocities and Nazi atrocities. So historical revisionism has been in full swing, and the kind of archaeological work, which was really important because they would turn up things like, here there were death camps. They found massive amounts of skulls, of bodies buried in the permafrost, and they found out just how many people were being killed. And this was, again, was a piece of a larger puzzle. During World War II, for example, you would have entire people being machine gunned down, or 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people just being worked to death to build a road. And understand this kind of thing was routine, and there was never any actual reckoning with this. And it continued onward. One of the things I was discussing in the article that you were mentioning was that Gorbachev was claiming there were no political prisoners. And an American journalist, congressman, actually went there. They met with some of those political prisoners, these very courageous people, one of whom actually asked for a Bible in the defiance of the KGB. And those political prisoners still existed. They existed under Gorbachev. So all this was built on a big lie, and the big lie perpetuates itself. It sustains itself, and we have never had a true reckoning. We still don't know the full death toll. There are estimates. The Black Book of Communism has estimates in Russia, has estimates worldwide, but those are just really partial figures. We don't know the full scope of the killing machine. We don't know the full scope of the atrocities because, indeed, the Soviet Union was never properly defeated. It just kind of transitioned from one regime to another. And that regime, while not communist under Putin, it's not communist per se, but it is very much invested in protecting the crimes, the atrocities of the KGB and the various elite who ran the country.
Yeah. Daniel, I've thought about this my entire life, that what a complexity in the human condition in terms of this lie in the Garden of Eden, when the serpent said to Eve, you can be God, you can live forever. And if you go and take that fruit from that forbidden tree, and we know that was that what had happened after that, that's where the left was born, and this pretension to equality, and you've written about this, and there's somewhere where there's the pursuit of immortality in a way, but it all stems from the serpent's lie in the Garden of Eden. And where I'm getting to this here is that these lack of Nuremberg trials is that with Nazism, with racism, that racial hatred is in our mindset, in humanity's mindset, in the Western mindset especially. It's an evil, and yes, it is an evil, and it should be an evil. So, and when people begin to say racist things, you immediately know that that could lead to many awful things, including Auschwitz. But class hatred is quite blurry. And so, I often think of this picture of there's just a homeless person laying on the ground, and there's all these rich people getting in and out of cars, and they're very wealthy, and a person comes up and goes, "This is not right. This is not right." And he's complaining and pointing out the injustice of this poor homeless man on the street, and pointing at all the rich people and saying, "This is not right." Now, a lot of people watching that might not completely understand. They might think, "Jamie, what are you talking about? I mean, that's not right, but we know, Daniel, those of us that know, that if that is a smart person and he tries to do certain things knowing in mind that you have to be very careful about generosity without wisdom, because if there's generosity without wisdom, you may run into problems. You have to be aware of what Thomas Sowell documented and wrote about the cost-benefit analysis, that with everything you do, there's consequences. And where I'm going with this is, unless that person is very wise and understands that human nature is flawed and that humans are driven by self-interest and many other things, there is a possibility that that person who's saying that and articulating that moral outrage, that he is a monster, and that what he will end up doing is the Cambodian killing fields with Khmer Rouge, the Maoist Cultural Revolution and Mao's killing fields, 80 million people, Stalinism. That it's very interesting, isn't it, Daniel, what a complex mystery in the human condition that that person articulating his moral outrage at the homeless man on the street, and there's a lot of rich people walking around, that that person could be the most dangerous person whose ideas will lead to mass murder if it's not done with wisdom.
I think we've had this dynamic for a while. It's the question of equity versus equality. With equality, you create equality of opportunity, you eliminate barriers. With equity, you force everyone down, Harrison Bergeron style, to the same level. And of course, you need a dictator to do that. I mean, who can actually make sure that everybody has just the same amount of food, the same amount of money, the same amount of sweaters, for example. So you need a dictator, you need somebody to impose price controls, wage controls, control over everything, which is where socialist regimes inevitably go. And the Soviet Union was the inevitable example of that. And I mean, you know, the term Soviet originally was supposed to be these workers' councils that would determine everything would be democratic. And of course, the democracy went out the window very quickly. And you had a centralized tyranny, one that became more and more centralized and eventually ossified. Because if you really want this idea that you're going to make everybody equal, of course, you have to make everybody unequal first by creating a supreme leader who is going to be in charge of that. And of course, when it becomes cults of personality, you need to pretend that this leader is godlike, that he is going to have the ability to transform society, to do the impossible, because he is somehow superhuman. And, you know, you discussed, of course, Garden of Eden, immortality. When my grandparents who were in Russia at the time, and they heard on the radio for the first time that Stalin is sick, they knew he was dead, because in the past there had never been any admission that Stalin was fallible enough to be sick. He had never been sick before, at least officially, because Stalin was supposed to be immortal. He is Stalin. He's the man of steel. And suddenly he was human. The moment they admit that he's human, that means he's already dead. And of course, they had to seek out, conduct a futile search for new immortals, new cult of personality figures. They eventually ended up with Putin. Gorbachev was obviously very much a failed cult of personality figures, but they never really, until Putin found somebody who would kind of embody this idea of being more than human, of being able to transcend normal limitations and transform everything. And of course, this turns out to be a lie. Every time you worship a human being, every time you believe a human being is godlike, you are, of course, doomed. You're engaging in pagan idolatry, and the end of that is going to be the complete destruction of everything you think is real, of everything you've been working for, and you're going to be left with, you know, like those fallen statues of Lenin, of Saddam Hussein, of Hitler. You're going to be left with broken stone and rubble.
Many years ago, because I'm getting old now, too many years have passed, but when I was a young fellow, I was a waiter, and in this one particular setting where I was a waiter, there was quite a few waiters, and it's interesting, very kind of artsy people, and they were all, not all, but mostly very left-wing, and they were just shocked at the things I was saying. They'd never heard anything like what I was saying. It's very interesting, the echo chamber these people live in. There was one particular individual there, I think he lost sleep over the things that I used to say, and he came up to me one time in rage, and he said, "It's because of people like you that communism doesn't work." And he was right up in my face. I still have nightmares about that. But I have often thought about that. It's because of me that communism doesn't, it's because of people like me that communism doesn't work. I'm very interested in the logic. So if communism works and people like me make it unworkable, when it begins to work, where am I in the equation?
That was the premise of the Soviet Union. You were going to purge everyone who had any kind of selfishness, any kind of self-interest, anybody who didn't fit into the system, who was not a collectivist, and then you would have this perfect collectivism And you ended up with Homo Sovieticus, which of course was entirely built on anybody stealing whatever they could get their hands on. This was the logical end result of the system. Instead of collectivism, you had a kind of individual complete amorality. But yes, this is something you absolutely encounter. So many people who actually encounter leftists who have come out of the Soviet Union have these stories, it was because of you. People should have actually pulled together. Mind you, these people who inevitably live in places like Canada or America or England, they never actually want to themselves go to the Soviet Union, give up their personal property and live this kind of life. It's the people over there whose job it is to do this.
Daniel, thank you. Daniel, it's interesting that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this moment a little bit where capitalism was legitimized and America and prosperity and free enterprise, communism has fallen. And yet now we look back, and some very fascinating people have written about this, that what had really happened? Because Daniel, the Soviet regime collapsed, but who's in power in the United States today? If you listen to what Kamala Harris says, to what Joe Biden says, to what Rashida Tlaib says and Ocasio-Cortez says, what Hillary Clinton says, if you listen carefully, these are the same themes that fertilize the soil in which Stalinism and Maoism and Castro, where their killing fields blossomed. Did the Soviet Union collapse? Or did the Soviet Union actually, in a very mystical, tricky way, seem to have blurred away? And then all of a sudden, America became the Soviet Union.
Yeah, very true. Early in the Cold War, we understood that we had to fight communism at home and communism abroad. There were domestic enemies and there were foreign enemies. And there was a point where JFK, where Republicans and Democrats were both on board with this idea. We had to defeat communism at home. We had legislation with the Communist Control Act. We were going to defeat these people within the United States. We recognized that they were a threat. And then the whole thing really collapsed, and we stopped thinking about communism at home. That was inappropriate. It was red baiting. We focused entirely on defeating communism abroad, which we sort of halfway did, but a bunch of the things that we did to do that were actually disastrous. We made a deal with China against the Soviet Union. The end result of that is China is actually now quite in a powerful position. They are still ruled by the Communist Party officially. That was obviously disastrous, but also communists at home were able to thrive. They were able to succeed. They were able to rebrand. They became progressives and socialists. And Bernie Sanders, who was visiting the Soviet Union and partying there, he's still a prospective presidential candidate, believe it or not, despite his age. And the movement that he's now part of is very much in ascendancy. The Democrats really have no counter to it, which is why people like Biden, Biden actually used to be a registered Republican back in the day, people who always pretended to be moderates, Biden originally kind of pretended to be a moderate, have wholesale adopted this radical leftist agenda, which very much is a direct pathway to Marxism, to communism. So, we defeated the Soviet Union as a regime. We did not, however, defeat our domestic communists, and as a result, they're taking over. And we really very much needed to do both. We needed to defeat communism at home. We needed to defeat it abroad, much as we need to defeat the jihad at home. We need to defeat it abroad. And we focused so much on defeating the jihad in Afghanistan, we didn't do very much, and we just pretty much abandoned at some point defeating the jihad at home. And this was, also a warning sign for the future, because you can't save the world if you can't save yourselves. And right now, we've given up on saving ourselves. We just focus on saving the world.
But we didn't defeat the idea, and the idea is now conquering us. And the way that the Bolsheviks took over in the Soviet Union, we see it here with what the Democrats are now doing with Biden in charge, what's happened to the intelligence agencies, not only what they're doing to and what they've done to people like General Michael Flynn and others, but what they're doing to the former president of the United States. And so and what they're doing here, it's a carbon copy of the blueprint of what was happening to the kulaks and what was happening to the enemies of the people, quote unquote, after the Soviet Revolution. And so what the FBI and the DOJ just recently did to Trump at his residence in Florida, what's going on there, Daniel? And you've written about this. Like, what's the crime? I thought that there has to be a crime, then you go in. But there's always this, this fishing expedition, and they're chasing ghosts. And now all of a sudden, as you've pointed out, they're pursuing obstruction of justice, which is really an admission that there's no crime. Before I let you go on this, I mean, just mind-boggling stuff. The FBI releases this picture of all these, classified documents on the floor all spread out. Trump didn't leave the documents like that laying around on the ground. So the FBI is taking stuff, putting them on the ground, taking pictures, trying to get approval from the people. This is not how the FBI is supposed to be behaving. All of this is quite a mess and actually indicating that there's something very Bolshevik going on, correct?
Somebody breaks into a store, smashes a window, starts grabbing merchandise out of it. A police officer comes, he fights the police officer, and he's charged with burglary and he's charged with resisting arrest, which makes perfect sense. But let's say he's just charged with resisting arrest. So what is the crime that he's resisting arrest for? Now, this is the essence of the whole idea of the process crime. This is the same thing that happened to General Flynn. You're charging people with obstruction of justice in an investigation of a crime. What is the crime? Well, there is no crime. The only crime that exists was generated by the investigation. This is basically an admission that there is nothing here. If you can't charge somebody with an actual crime that is not derived from the investigation itself, then this entire thing is a witch hunt. It's a fishing expedition. It's what investigators are doing in order to save face, in order to make themselves look good, or in order to go after somebody they want to go after anyway. People are very much focused attention on the FBI and the intelligence community. The bottom line is we know who is pulling the strings here. We know it's the people who are around Obama, the people around Biden. They are backed by a lot of big money, by people like George Soros, for example. And, going back to our conversation about communism and the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, this is what they do. They take over any organization that they can get into. And if you don't push back, if you don't aggressively resist that, then they will take over. They have a lot of methods of getting in. It's like a virus. If they don't get in one way, they're going to get in another way. If you don't actively take measures to keep them out, which again goes back to the whole Communist Control Act, to the debate about fighting an internal war against communism or an external one. When you don't actually do something to keep communists, to keep radical leftists, to keep Marxists and progressives and whatever they call themselves out of an organization, they are going to take over. And they're very good at taking things over. They're not good at running them, as we see in the Soviet Union, but they are great at taking over an organization, especially when that organization does not have any fundamental, meaningful ethos. Taking over a successful business where people are working hard is tricky for them. A company that is really just a monopoly, that is non-productive, that is just coasting, that they can do. And a big federal government, that is so easy for them because, what's a federal government? It's composed of union members, of people there who want to do as little work as possible, who are in the DC area and various major urban areas, who are openly mobile, who are absorbing a lot of left-wing propaganda anyway. Recruiting those people is a joke for them. It's ridiculously easy. And that's how they actually control the federal government. Elections come and go, but the administrative state is under the control of the left. We see this in polls of federal workers over and over again. The majority of them are on the left. And, we have one of two options. One, we basically dismantle much of the federal government, which is what the conservative project used to be about. Or two, we deal with the reality that we're living in the new Soviet Union.
Daniel, Trump must be such a good man. They hate him so much. They are so scared of him. They really got to take this guy out. And he must be a really good man. And I think he is. And you've got, Klaus Schwab and Harari and George Soros and these globalists and the World Economic Forum. And yeah, they're building quite an interesting world. And Trump's in their way. And he obstructed everything they were trying to do in 2016. They thought they had the cat in the bag. But they really are terrified that he might come back Is that what this is all about? They are terrified that he may run again. And if he runs again, you've got a guy in the White House that cares about America and cares about borders and might not just go along with the international digital ID and all this, all of these globalist plans that they have to build their antichrist network.
Well, Jamie, as you've written in the past, the left is very much defined by hate. I believe you've written a very, very popular book on that theme. The left is very much defined by hate, and what Trump did so effectively was trigger them. He triggered them into going beyond. So the left was really based in America, was based around proceeding slowly and carefully and consolidating power in a more steadier fashion. But obviously, anytime a Republican gets into the White House, they go crazy. We had this with Nixon. We had this with Reagan. We had this with Bush Jr. But with Trump, there was something special because he would repeatedly taunt them and he would infuriate them on a cultural level, which made them even crazier than they were before. And, the left was very crazy and hateful to begin with. So they are showing more of their cards, which is potentially helpful, but it also means that they're radicalizing faster, which means things are going downhill faster. So it's a kind of precarious situation because on the one hand, the left is showing more of its true colors. On the other hand, it is showing more of its true colors in that it's actually moving faster to be more ruthless, to consolidate power. And it means that a response is even more urgent for conservatives. And if we don't have that response, then they're just going to see total weakness and seize complete power, which is the very risky place we're at now. It's a very dangerous place to be because for the left now, they're seeing that we don't have to wait anymore because seemingly we're not seeing any resistance. In the past, they've been advised you have to move carefully, you have to work within the system. You can't just have a revolution. This is what they've been internalizing in the baby boomer generation since the 60s. And if they actually get the sense, and they've gotten that sense very much, we can do anything we want. So you see things like Biden deciding, okay, I'm just going to abolish student loan debt. I'm just going to decide that we're going to vastly expand the IRS and the powers of the IRS. And, they're pushing him to do even more radical things. And he still, in theory, is going to spend some time in office. And at this point, things become particularly dangerous because if they see the Republicans are not doing anything about it, they're just going to see how far they can push it. And we know from history, from China, from the Soviet Union, Cuba, Cambodia, that the left can push things very, very far.
Well, we're learning now from what Biden's saying and the people around him, and the leftist media just loves what he's saying recently. I really didn't know that I was a fascist. I didn't know that you were a fascist, Daniel. What does this mean that anybody that supports Trump is a fascist? Like, what does that mean? And what a trivialization. How much it trivializes the people that suffered under fascism.
Oh, it's very interesting, the use of the term specifically fascist. Obama would give these lectures. He would say, this is not who we are. They're defined by hate and violence. And Biden is doing some of that. But specifically using the term fascist is interesting because it's specifically the people who use the term fascist to refer to their political enemies are almost invariably communists and Marxists. They're the ones who tend to use the term fascist. With liberals, it was right-wing, populist, authoritarian. We didn't really see the term fascist. So you have to wonder who exactly is programming Biden's teleprompter and who's whispering in his ear, and what are the political affiliations of those people. We saw under FDR, all the way back then, you could actually have communists very close inside the White House. We've seen this recur time and time again, and you have to wonder just how extreme are the people who are the puppet masters for the Biden regime.
Daniel, we've got some FBI whistleblowers. We've got this FBI agent who was escorted out of the Bureau recently. To the best of my knowledge and memory, he was involved in covering up the whole Hunter Biden thing. What's going on over there?
People are calling for eliminating the FBI. I think that would be a good idea to eliminate much of the federal government, but there are good people in the FBI. There are people there who are dedicated to American security, to fighting our enemies, to fighting Islamic terrorists, but they have very little scope because you've got so many of the political appointees there. People are part of the network, particularly people under Obama who were ushered in, now under Biden they're being ushered in, and they're forced to keep quiet. they're disgusted at what's going on, and some of them are clearly contacting. Some of them contacted Senator Chuck Grassley. Some of them contacted Senator Ron Johnson, who's now up for re-election. And they're actually trying to get the word about what's going on. And the Biden DOJ is so panicked that they had actually Attorney General Merrick Garland issued this letter warning DOJ personnel not to speak to Congress without going through the DOJ. No, we have three branches of government telling members of a federal agency that they can't talk to Congress without the approval of a White House appointee. This is, we talk a lot about coups, but there is that element there. You're insisting that only the Biden administration should have complete and total authority over federal agencies, and that all DOJ matters can only go through them, and that Congress has no right to even get any kind of information. This really shows just what kind of abusive situation this is, and how totalitarian and how, used the term Bolshevik, this arrangement is.
Daniel, another fascinating blog of yours, Obama is back to undermining Biden. Fascinating. Obama always, as you show in your piece, Obama always had a problem with Biden. Just interesting. He had a problem with Biden, but Biden was always around. Then there was one point where I think he wanted to distance himself from Biden and bring in Hillary, and that didn't kind of work out. But Obama is undermining Biden right now, right?
Well, there is a big crisis for the Democrats because Biden is very determined. He wants to stay in power. He wants to run again. The Democrats desperately want him to go away, and they have to push on various levers to make that happen. I think Hunter Biden, we're going to see, is one of those levers. Obama, because Biden's big only real base are Black voters. So this is kind of a signal from Obama that he could actually set out to undermine Biden in a very big way with his loyal base if he tries to run again. And we know this. We know that Obama had nothing but contempt for Joe Biden. He picked this coolest old white guy he had probably nothing but contempt for. Obama is already a racist to begin with. Having Biden in there probably only fed those instincts. But, why did Obama pick Biden? Well, much for the same reason that Biden picked Kamala. Obama wanted somebody who could not replace him, who would just, voters would take a look at it and go, oh, no, that's not happening. And Biden was the perfect choice because, voters would absolutely not replace Obama with Biden, much as voters would not replace Biden with Kamala Harris. Republicans try to pick a vice president who makes them stronger. Democrats pick one who they don't have to be paranoid about, who they think could never replace them. And Obama has undermined Biden repeatedly. He kept him from running against Hillary. He apparently even wanted Hillary to replace him in 2012. So, Biden kept talking about during the primaries how close he was to Obama, how much he did with Obama. Obama did absolutely nothing. He actually promoted another candidate who, Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, who seemed to a lot of people kind of like Obama, but that candidacy went nowhere. So I think if Obama does decide to win in any kind of big way, he's going to try to undermine Biden where he can. He's going to have his particular candidate. We don't know who it is yet, but maybe he'll give Deval Patrick another try, or somebody like that, Cory Booker, somebody who can kind of carry on his legacy and remind voters of him.
It's going to be fascinating what's going to happen because, Daniel, there's a couple times, well, maybe not a couple, many times, but there was a couple times Biden was like handing the pen over to somebody recently, and the look on his face was complete and utter dementia. Like, this guy is gone. What's going to happen? Do you think he's going to last another 2 years? I doubt it. Otherwise, it'll just be even more tragic, but maybe not so much tragic because he's a puppet, actually. And so it's tragic for us, but maybe it works for the Democrats on one level because they're just controlling him and doing whatever they want. But if he goes, I don't even think the Democrats would allow Kamala to come in. But if she does, we can take turns sobbing, but then maybe getting a little bit of popcorn and watch it all go crumbling down, because that'll be a real theater, but a very tragic theater, right?
I mean, there's multiple tragedies here. Biden, in his selfishness, instead of picking somebody who could replace him, picked somebody that he knew would act as a human shield so he doesn't face the 25th Amendment, because Democrats would be more afraid of Kamala than they would of him, because he's at least somewhat controllable, and Kamala would potentially have her own electorate and they would be stuck with her. That is their ultimate nightmare. If Biden drops dead now, they're stuck with Kamala as their nominee, and that would be an absolute nightmare for them. So, whatever drugs, whatever meth they have to pump into Biden to keep him going, they're doing that. If they have to do Weekend at Bernie's and they just carry him around and maybe pump some electricity into him, they'll do that. But there is a tragedy here, which is that Joe Biden, who's been doing this for 50 years, he's spent 50 years in politics, he has absolutely nothing to show for it. He's accomplished nothing. And he's just clinging desperately to power. His mind is half gone, and yet he's obsessed with just hanging on to power for what? And there's no real explanation. He's accomplished nothing. He's done nothing. He's served the left. He's willing to sell out whatever he believes in at any point in time in order to have this power. And it's a moral tragedy. It's a religious tragedy. It's just this emptiness. There's this huge hollowness of this man who, might have done something worthwhile with his life, might have made some kind of difference, or, just might have at least lived some sort of decent life. And instead it chose this. He chose complete greed for power. And now he's a ruin. He's a shell of his former self, but he can't let go. He's clinging to it.
So surreal. Almost everywhere we look, it's surreal. But I have two images in mind, one of Biden and one of Kamala especially. But just everywhere we look, it's just I don't know, there's some kind of some kind of absurd, sadistic mockery happening and being perpetrated against us by demons, I think, of some kind, because just everywhere we look, this whole COVID thing is just bizarre, and the dots on the floor we were supposed to stand on, people still walking around with masks. I can't believe how many people are still walking around with masks by themselves down the street. But anyway, with Joe Biden, I think really what took the cake was during the campaign, he was talking about the kids in the pool rubbing his hairy legs. It's just one of the weirdest things that I ever watched and listened to. With Kamala, Daniel, remember how excited she was telling those kids about space? And the whole thing was rehearsed and set up. It's utterly absurd.
She's incredibly hollow in her own way. You can't blame dementia here. You can't blame her age. There's just never been anything there, which is also kind of sad. There are people like that. There's just nothing inside except this kind of ambition, but ambition for what? She doesn't really believe in anything either. She just wants this power that she's completely unfit to handle. She can't even do the speeches. She can't do the campaigning, unlike they were billing her as a female Obama. She can't even do the political stuff. She's completely inept at it. She's the daughter of this very wealthy Indian immigrant cancer researcher who raised her in very privileged conditions. She hung out with San Francisco socialites. She hooked up with Willie Brown, a man much older than her, and allowed him to use her in order to get up higher up the ladder. And now she's almost all the way up the ladder. She's vice president, yet everybody is telling her over and over again she's never going to be president. Her career is over. Her staffers are deserting her. And again, there's another moral tragedy here. Maybe she could have done something worthwhile with her life. Instead, she has no children. She got almost all the way up to the power, the ultimate power. What would she do with it? Again, she has no idea there either. These people are just kind of empty. There's no soul there. There's no moral drive. There's no sense of I'm giving up something for others. It's me, and and all that meanness and all that desire to be articulated, to be heard, to be seen, to have everybody pay attention to you. They get it. They're there. They're on the big stage, and yet they still feel empty inside.
And yet they're building a better world. And we're the fascists, Daniel. Daniel, before we go, very quickly, please, when you go to bed the last couple nights, what's primarily on your mind?
Well, there are bedtime prayers to God, obviously. But beyond that, I really think of how our society seems to be tearing itself apart. And as I get older myself, I can look back and see that times were troubled before, but it does seem like we've lost faith, we've lost confidence, we've lost any sense that things could possibly be better. I just see despair all around us, whether it's on the left or on the right. So many people are just feeling, and this is what I hear when I'm at speaking events, when I interact with so many conservatives, there is this sense of it's all over. And I think this is part of the big problem, is that, and this is a problem that's affecting America, but it's also affecting Republicans more than we like to admit, which is that people are really giving up on God. They're giving up on religion. We can see this in various surveys and poll numbers. People are just losing faith. They're losing faith in God. And without that, they're just reduced to believing in men, the believing that human beings are going to save us. And when human beings don't, then there's the same loss of faith, the same collapse that we've seen in the Soviet Union and other places that just entirely relied everything on people. And, it's very important for people, for the leaders we support, for ourselves, for our colleagues, to do what we can. We also have to remember that there is a higher power, there is a higher destiny that actually determines things. There is a quote that I live by from George Washington that was supposedly said at the Constitutional Convention, which is, "Let us raise a banner to which the wise will gather, all else the event is in the hands of God." Now, this is something we need to remember. We have to do everything we can. We also have to remember that everything is ultimately in the hands of God. God can take the mightiest powers, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and bring them down. He can take a tiny nation like America or Israel. America, the original 13 colonies were quite tiny, and suddenly raise it up. Everything is ultimately in the hands of God. What we are doing for God. We're doing to fulfill God's plan. And when we forget that, when we think it's all in our hands, it's all in human hands, then it becomes all too easy to despair. And this is something we really need to keep in mind.
Very profound words, Daniel. Thank you. It was, as always, a great privilege and honor to have you on the Glazov Gang. Keep up the truth-telling and all the brave work and all the brilliant writing, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you for another great and inspirational conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for watching the Glazov Gang this evening. You should be going to frontpagemag.com. There's a blog there called The Point by Daniel Greenfield. You're missing out if you're not reading it. Go to the blog The Point at frontpagemag.com, start reading it, and press refresh every 5 minutes. We'll see you soon on the Glazov Gang. Good night. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I recently got one of Mike Lindell's pillows and comforters at mybillow.com, and I started getting some of the most restful sleeps in my life. And you can do the same. Go to mypillow.com and use code GG21 to get incredible and amazing discounts. Or just call 1-800-854-0673. While you're doing that, you'll know that you're supporting Mike Lindell, a true American hero fighting a true American cause. And you'll also be supporting the Glazov Gang. Thank you. May God bless you, and may God bless America.